Yeah, I really appreciate you guys having me come down here. This is going to be fun. My name is John Toole, and I work at the University of Minnesota's grape breeding program. It's a satellite research center, not quite at the campus, but outside the Twin Cities a little bit. And I also have 4 acres of vineyard with my parents in central Minnesota. So I get to dabble in the commercial side as well as the research side and see how those two sides compare a little bit. Without too much more delay, I'll get started here. The research station that I work at is called the Horticultural Research Center in Minnesota, and it was started as a fruit breeding farm way back in 1908. So it's got quite a good history already, and they were doing grape breeding, but mostly a lot of apple breeding back then. And it's kind of the same today. There's a lot of apple breeding and small fruit breedings, but the grapes have definitely come up in the last 30 or so years with a lot of focus on wine quality grapes. As you can see, there's many different things in the greenhouse at different times. There's woody landscape plants being bred out there as well, so it's a very interesting place to come visit. Right here you can see some of the history of some of the people that have worked there throughout the years. Right here, Elmer Swenson was very instrumental in a lot of our varieties. He worked at the HRC from '69 until about maybe late '70s, somewhere in there. And through his efforts, Edelweiss and Swenson Red were released as a joint effort between the university and Elmer. But he also went on and to release, not only he did, but a lot of other folks had released some of his varieties that he was so giving and sharing with. They went on and named a lot of varieties. So you're familiar with some of his things, and you'll see those throughout the northern grape growing regions. Currently, the breeder at the University of Minnesota is Peter Hempstead right here. So he's the guy that's actually the one evaluating all the grapes, making the decisions on what to make for crosses. We're there to support him and take care of those grapes. So we basically have somewhere in the vicinity of around 11 acres of research vines, which is quite substantial. Especially when they're packed in there so tightly as we do. We've got a spacing of about 2 feet per vine when they go into the rows, and then the rows are 9 or 10 feet apart. But they start out very tight, and they have to prove themselves over the years. So it's a really interesting process to see how they're growing, and I'll show how that looks. We also have hundreds of name varieties and wild accessions from all over the world, in fact, as sort of a genetic bank for our breeding. So we have a lot of high quality grapes there, the things that you're familiar with, the Cabernet, the Pinot, all that good stuff, Riesling, and then as well as a lot of obscure stuff. So it's quite a variety. It's very interesting to see all that. Like I said, there's right around 10,000 different seedlings out there, so different genotypes that exist in the vineyards at this moment, and they're spread over 7 different vineyard blocks, and 11 acres is what that covers. So every year we plant out a couple of thousand seedlings into the nursery setting, and those seedlings get it's a very rigorous first step. If they have some disease, they're getting killed in that first year already in that nursery. So in year 1, maybe if we planted out 3,000, we might see 1,000 of those only making the cut in the first season, which will eventually go into one of the 7 vineyards later on. So this is how it all kind of starts, though. There's really 3 aspects that are going on simultaneously. We're generating new seedlings constantly through crossbreeding, which is happening in June, generally. Then we're also maintaining those vines, the ones that are in fruiting production at the same time. And there's a constant evaluation of selected vines and selected fruits. And then there's wine trials that are being done as well. So it's a very interesting dynamic of things going on. It's just never slow at work, let's put it that way. As you can see here, this is how they start in the springtime. We've got them in the greenhouse growing. These would be our little seedlings from the previous year's crosses, and they're all standing there nicely, ready to go to battle in the field, I guess. So I want to walk you through what it is kind of like for a season working there. In April, we're bringing out potted vines of specific pollen plants that have good characteristics, but like these plants, for instance, these are generally vinifera type grapes, the ones that are grown in Europe and California and all the warmer climates of the world. They bloom late when we grow them in Minnesota. We can grow them with a covered technique that protects them over the winter, but they always bloom late, so the timing of the pollination is off. So we force them to bloom earlier in the greenhouse, so we get that kind of pollen early. It's a very interesting thing, and it's nice to see some greenery when there's still snow on the ground anyway. This is what that is looking like when they're blooming. And you see this out in the field as well, but this would be in the greenhouse setting where the pollen caps are popping off, and we're now able to collect that pollen off of this particular variety right here. So that pollen gets saved to an extent for just a couple of weeks, and then when we want to, we can take it and selectively bring it outside and breed onto the vines that we want to out there. So you can see here, there's like one cluster on a whole vine might get pollinated through the breeding, and we have maybe 30 to 50 crosses all over the place in the different fields. So the flowers, if you've ever seen or done that kind of pollination process, it's a very tedious, time-consuming, emasculating process where you're going to take each stamen off of each flower and still be careful not to mess up the female portion, the pistil. And it's not for somebody who's antsy or likes to move around a lot. You got to really sit there for like 20 minutes and know what you're doing. I get kind of crazy if I do it. But we leave that bag on there the whole season then so that we can come and find it when the fruit is ripe and collect it, and now we know that our new genetics is hiding within those seeds, that new combination. The fruit will still look the same as all the other fruit on the vine, it's just that the seeds contain the new combination. And you know, like I said, we develop maybe 3,000, 5,000 of those seeds each season. When we've collected those bags, which would be around September, October time, and it's a nice cold, windy, wet day or something, it's time to open those bags up and then actually get those seeds extracted out of there. So we pop them open like that. Sometimes if they're flavorful enough, we'll eat them, but generally they're too sour. So we'll get them out of there, we'll clean them up a little bit, we'll dry them off for a bit, and then they get stratified for the winter. And that's probably about a 3 to 4 month process where they're just sitting cool in the refrigerator in a nice soil, a peat, like a germination mix or something where it's wet and you got air on it, but definitely safe and contained. So next spring then, this would be the next season in March. We sow those seedlings and they start in these little trays really tight like that, and when they come up nicely, you can see them popping up here. And the first comes out these little cotyledons, and then next comes the true leaf. And when the true leaf comes, that's when we know it's time to transplant them. And so from that little tiny tray, they're going into these larger flats to have their own space. So they'll spend another couple of weeks in here so they can beef themselves up a little bit and show the growth, and then we can eventually harden them off and put them out in the nursery. Now here's that process. They're at this stage, they've got a couple of inches of growth. They're going to go out to the sunlight finally because they've been in the greenhouse for a couple of weeks. And then they finally go to the nursery, and everybody's out helping with that day. It's kind of a nice day, nice to get it all done in one shot for sure. But that would be about June, depending on the weather. This year was really late on us. It was just raining. We couldn't get into that nursery until later. But it always seems to work. And then you just sort of wait for the weeds to come. There is things that you can do to prevent weeds, of course. You can put pre-emergence down. Surfland is one of the things that we use quite often to keep weeds from sprouting right after we plant. But at some point, the purslane does pick up, and I got to go through there with the tiller and get that down. Purslane is nice, though. It's pretty edible, so if you're hungry, you can munch on that. It's really juicy. But when it's all cleaned up and nice, this is the way we want it, so that the evaluator, Peter, can just come along and start looking at those vines and determining how much disease is this one getting compared to its neighbor, and he can start thinning through that herd already at this point. And you can see we have a simple irrigation drip line thing right here, so when we need to turn the water on, it's very convenient to do that. So there's somewhere in the realm of 2,000 to 3,000 seedlings right in here at this point. And then you can see some of our other field trial fields in the background here and elsewhere. It's quite a process. So in the fall then, when they're done and they've been selected, we'll dig them out of that nursery and then store them in a root cellar, just like a nursery would. And these are then ready to be planted the following season into a more permanent home where they can actually start to fruit then, because it'll take 2 to 3 years before we'll see fruit, right? So this is kind of a nice long process. You got to be patient. You always got crosses from the previous years coming forward, and you're always making the new crosses that you anticipate for the future. And it's a nice timeline to get in your mind what's happening. So here we are planting them out the next season into either new vineyard space sometimes or existing vineyard space. It depends on what we can do. It's a small crew. It's me and my wife Jenny right here, and then we have 2 extra helpers this year, which are doing a great job with us. But it's quite a bit to manage, all these little different vines. But in that first season, you can see how tight they're planted. Every 2 feet apart, they get planted. And then we train them up on these bamboo that go up to the top wire. So everything goes to the high wire just as a default system. We can notice their differences according to that. If a variety wants to be really upright, it'll show that. But if it wants to droop, it's suited to be on the high cordon that way. Here's those vines at the end of the first season. So they've grown. We've trained 1 shoot up, 1 nice straight trunk. They've reached top wire. Usually we can already get some fruit in the second season. We don't want to burden them too much with a lot of fruit, but it does happen that some of these guys will fruit in the next season. It depends on how hard the winter was on them as well. Various conditions can affect that. But hopefully by about when the vine gets a little bit more mature, you start to see what is actually out there, and it's so much fun to go through those vineyards, and it's like 10,000 different grapes out there. You get 10,000 different flavors going on, and 10,000 different looking vines. And so if anybody's ever interested, we do have this field day in September, and I'll talk about it more later, where we have grapes on plates, and I'd invite all of you to come up there someday. This year it's September 6th, 10 o'clock. It's always the first Saturday after Labor Day, and we do an open house field tour. It's free. Here's just 2 shots I had of just some promising vines out there. There's many of them, of course, but we're always looking for nice, clean fruit, open growth habit. There's many different criteria that Peter runs them through, disease resistance, how well they can hold up into the fall, all of these things. But it's really hard to get all the combinations just right. It's like taking a 12-sided dice and shaking it with another one and trying to get the right combination, and it's a lot. As far as managing those vines and then other projects, I'll get into that here a little bit more. I'm always, I entered into the picture in 2005 and overlapped with Brad, in fact, for a couple of years there, which was really nice. He was in the winery, I was out in the vineyard. But there was a lot of vines that existed before I got there, and some of these things have been getting really curly. So I've been working hard to straighten up some of these trunks and fix these through pruning. So in fact, this vine had 2 trunks just as bad like this. And I kept hitting it with the tractor and whatnot, and so it's very easy to retrain a nice straight trunk and get that guy on the up and up. And so we're working on that. But it's a phase-in process. We definitely don't want to change the vine profile too much too quickly. So now that I'm really dedicated on making the vineyards nice, and I got my training in Germany where things are exact and tick-tock. You got to be on getting it very nicely looking like that. So I'm very used to that nice looking vine. I don't want to let things get out of control too much. The more in control, the better, the easier it is to evaluate, the easier it is to keep all your next tasks easier. It just, everything falls into place if you get things going straightly. Here we are pruning, a group of us prune. It's usually just me and Jenny. We start in February when the snow is so deep, and then by the time we're done, it's right around tax time, because we're doing all these other little things in between. We're also doing propagation of the promising vines that Peter has selected over time, and that's an interesting little thing to see those guys budding out in February and March. We do a little bit of rootstock research, which has been picking up in the last years. We're trying to understand what would be some good characteristics to look for in a rootstock. Of course, we got the market on hardiness in Minnesota, I would think. So we could develop some nice new hardy rootstocks, as well as things that could tolerate wetter soils, because a lot of these are based in riparia, and a few other varieties as well. But there's some good attributes coming out of these. We do quite a bit of bud dissection. That's where we can evaluate our hardiness. That's one method of evaluating the hardiness of the vine, is through the actual bud dissection. We do a little bit of grafting as well with different things to trial those rootstocks. So since we don't do a lot of rootstocks, I developed a little method where I take a little twist tie, and I don't always have the nicest material for rootstocks. We use what we have available and we want to see. So it's generally a little bit thinner of wood material than like nurseries in California would be using. So I hold it together with this little twist tie, and then I'll actually wax them a little bit later in the process. But it seems to be working pretty well. I get a nice callus. We're holding them in a humid environment in this wet perlite and whatnot, and it's taking on pretty good. I just want to diverge a little bit into that bud dissection and let you know what that's all about. This would be a primary shoot that you're looking at, and this would be on the cane or on the spur. It's a bud that is sleeping and dormant, so we're checking these in March usually. And you can see in this picture already, that's the shoot. That's the tiny compressed shoot that had developed the previous season during the previous summer. These little striations, those are nodes and internodes. And there's like leaflets on the side here and fruit and whatnot. That's all hiding in there from the previous season. So it's a very important concept to know. Here you can see what that shoot would look like when it expands out. It just essentially is telescoping outward. These leaves already preformed, this cluster is preformed in the previous season. So the previous season really determines how well those vines are going to perform in combination with how hard the winter was. So it's not only the coldest part of the winter that affects this buds, it's also the previous year. The crop load, the growing degree days, all these different things. The amount of sunlight, there's a lot of different stresses that influences how many fruits and clusters are going to be formed. Here again, you can see when things are working really nice, you got very healthy shoots developing. Sometimes the buds are so vigorous growing that two shoots want to push, the primary and the secondary. You don't see the tertiary. There is a tertiary bud in here, but you don't see it. They're generally very fruitful on their first primary bud, but they're not as fruitful on their secondary bud in general, but they can still be fruitful. But the tertiary, if you're relying on tertiary buds, you don't have much fruit at all. And that's sort of where we're at in Minnesota with some of our vines is a lot of people are relying on tertiary buds this season, kind of dormant or hiding buds, reserve buds and whatnot. Here's what it looks like when you've got primary bud damage. So when you make that little cross-sectional cut with a razor blade, and you can do this in your own vineyard if you have a little spyglass to kind of magnify it a little bit, it's a good practice to check your vines before you're pruning and see how they're performing. Because if you have a lot of primaries, you're going to probably want to leave more buds to keep that crop load up, right? So if you have like 90% of these frozen off, you can still maybe rely on some secondaries, but they're not going to be as fruitful. So you can increase your bud count and still get the production there. But when you have this scenario, there's not much you can do. You just have to hope that something comes from the cordon or the trunk still, because in this case, both primary and secondary bud have been burned by the winter and frozen out. We saw a lot of that this year. Here's where you see the tertiary bud. Here's the primary bud, secondary. All three buds burned, or frozen, I guess. And the thing to note about in this photo is if you ever check your buds and you go too deeply with your knife or whatever you're using to open them up, you're going to get this false positive where it looks green down here, and that's not it. You have to be cutting right through here to get the real answer how well they're performing. If you're cutting too deep, it's going to look green. You're going to be like, oh, everything's fine. I can prune as normal. But that's cambium. That's into the xylem. You're into the shoot material at that point. And talking about the canes and whatnot, this is what that would look like as a cross section. So the center pith is always, that's just spongy brown material. That's normal. Your first ring layer is the xylem. That's the water transport vessels. Then you've got cambium, which gives rise to the new layers each season. And on the outer layer is phloem. Phloem is the sugar transporting vessels and nutrient transporting. And then on the very outside is the bark, or the periderm, which it turns from green to brown as the season rolls on. When everything looks nice, you've got nice xylem, you've got nice cambium, everything is green, 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 and then you've got this brown periderm on the outside. But if you have problems, like we've seen this year, in vines that are not hardy, you're going to see this browning just underneath the skin. And that's an indication that you've got phloem damage especially. Now the vines sometimes can recover out of that, but often it's best to start thinking about growing up new trunks, new shoots, new cordons when you see a lot of winter damage. And marginal varieties everywhere around the world will always show damage. I mean, we're always trying to push the limits of where we can grow things. You know, people try to grow Riesling where it works 9 years out of 10, but you know, in the 10th season, you're going to see this. So it just means time to replace once in a while. Okay, back to what we're doing. So like March, if we're thinking about what we're doing in March, there's a lot of wine sensory analysis going on at that time as well. Nice to get out of the cold a little bit and into the warm building and warm up with some wine. Now, not all of the wine that was made the previous fall is going to be the best. I mean, sometimes we've never made wine from these grapes, so it's just interesting to see how they perform in these sensory trials. So there'll be like 60 to 80 wines that we try through in the springtime, different. As April comes around, we get a little bit warmer, finally, in Minnesota. Seems like winter never lets go. But here you can see the vines. These are the vinifera that were covered. And this is the amount of straw that was on top of them. They were pinned to the ground, and they're brought back up now in April. And this is called the Mini J training system, where the vines are growing as like a VSP vine, vertical shoot positioning vine, on the low cordon here. And then the shoots are meant to go upward. But we have these flexible young trunks that are constantly being renewed. So as a trunk gets fairly old, 6 to 10 years old, they're getting really inflexible at that point. So we keep in a constant rotation. We always have one new shoot coming up and maybe about two more older ones. And if it's young and flexible, it's easy to pin down, but if they get older and harder, we start planning on, we always have an exit plan for those older trunks. We have to have new ones in place at the same time. Mm-hmm.
What's the height of your cordon wire on it?
This first wire is about 34, 36, somewhere in there. And then the next catch wire pair is 7 inches above that. And then we go max it out to the top wire here. And then the middle wire, so the top wire would be maybe 5'9", 5'10", whatever the posts allow. And the distance between the first catch wire and then the second pair is somewhere between 12 and 14 inches generally. But it's very important to have that first catch wire pair close to those shoots, because if the shoots get too long before they get caught into the catch wires, they're going to swing out, right? So a lot of folks I see putting in VSP trellis, they always have like 12 inches to this first catch wire. That's no good. It's 6 to 8 inches is kind of where you want to be, depending on variety and where it sets its fruit. Here would be out in the regular vineyards where we're just growing them to the high cordon and tying them up. Now, I always like to be done tying before they bud out, but here we are working with the buds already swollen out, and it makes it a little trickier. You've got to be that much more delicate with these kind of guys. But we get the job done. It's also a time in the year where I check, and if there's a lot of weeds coming, it's a great time to do herbicide. So we keep it pretty clean under the vines. I've done that herbicide before the suckers even come out, and I can lay down a pre-emergent if I wish at the same time. So whether it's a Roundup and pre-emergent Surfland combination or something, we keep those weeds at bay for most of the season. Now this year, I don't mind the weeds coming in after we've done suckering. So at this point in the season, there's been a lot of weeds growing. And in fact, any kind of Roundup issue that people talk about, like the salt of the Roundup, tying up nutrients and whatnot, I think if you let the weeds grow a little bit, the organics starts working, you get some liveliness in the soil. You kind of activate that soil by having weeds growing and roots and microbes and all that working. So I like weeds sometimes. I'm not a fanatic about having it clean all the time, but right here you can see it's looking good. Also, those cuttings that we had started back in February, March, it's time to pull them out and check them, see how they've done. So we can have anything from everything looking beautiful, top and bottom, beautiful roots, beautiful top, to maybe beautiful roots but nothing happening on the top, or both, nothing on the bottom, nothing on the top. So that's one of our ways of evaluating how well those vines survived our winter. So this was just this past season, so this particular guy right here came through in flying colors, I think, as far as rooting and propagating on top. So that would be a wonder vine for nurseries, I would say, and for you too to grow. But it's early in the evaluation process. It's just getting looked at now, so we don't even know. There's a lot of different things. Of course, the spring jobs that are going on are the suckering, the shoot thinning, the tucking, planting and spraying, all those regular things that everybody's doing. This year particularly, we had a lot of suckers that we needed to keep on certain vines because we had so much damage on top. So it's a big rebuild year for us in Minnesota. But when I'm growing up suckers on an older vine that's been winter damaged, I'm definitely keeping a number of suckers. I'm looking for that Goldilocks kind of growth. I don't want too fast and I don't want too slow. I need it just right. It's got to be in this Goldilocks range by the end of the season. So we keep multiple suckers to keep the balance of each one. If you focus one shoot up early in the season and you get rid of all the rest, you're going to usually end up with these bull canes. So that's kind of some strategy that I've learned I employed in my own vineyard, and I do it at work on promising vines that, we want to keep them around if they got a little damage, and that's one of my techniques. As you can see here how badly some of these trunks were damaged. It's awful. That's a lot of phloem issue right there. The phloem was frozen and it's trying to heal itself with callus material. That's the bumpy looking stuff. And if you have crown gall present in the soil, that bacteria, it will get in there and it will aggravate and spread, and it will look very cancerous in a couple more years. So in a vine like this, I'm definitely planning on growing up a new shoot and phasing this trunk out within another season or two, as soon as I can. So during the June period, we got, of course, a lot of nice growth going on. It's a beautiful time for us to identify female vines, because in the breeding program, it's not like your vineyard where you have perfect flowers where the male and female parts are on the flowers. We have to search for the vines that are female or male or perfect flowering. And like in the wild, all the vines in the wild are female or male. You can tell pretty easily that the females, they have these really retracted stamens that are curled under, and it's pretty easy to see those. So we'll mark those with a flag, give them a pink or something like that so we know it's a girl. And we would realize then we're not going to be able to really release a female. I mean, St. Pepin is a female vine that people do grow, and it does marginally okay. But you want to have perfect flowering vines when you release them so that they can self-pollinate, and you don't have to rely on pollination or wind blowing wild pollen into those vines. So that's our one chance, is in June. When the breeding is going on, we can also check for females in the vines. They're getting further advanced now with doing the genetic analysis of that, and I'll get into that a little bit too. They can determine femaleness at the first stage just from snippets of leaves.
Did you say all wild vines are either female or male?
Pretty much. I mean, in rare instances, you'll see the hermaphrodite flower forming. That's very rare, and that's what early humans have selected a long, long time ago, and that's why we have perfect flowering vines now. But in general, you can look at most riparia vines that are growing in the woods. They're going to either be male or female. Yeah. A nice diseasey spring we had. We do want to evaluate diseases, so we have sort of a minimal spray program, I would put it. And when it's minimal, this is kind of how bad it can get. And I know a lot of you guys are seeing some black rot issues in your vines this year as well, but this is downy mildew on this particular vine. This is actually in our hybrid field. There's a tender hybrid field that we also cover, but this particular one here is full of downy mildew. Every cluster is affected, so you can see how bad that can get. Now, spraying program, I'm not going to get into spraying too much, but there's totally good remedies to fix that by early sprays, combination sprays, those mancozebs and whatnot, rally combinations, really knock that stuff out in the early season. Shoot positioning and fruit exposure, it's a big job all the time. We're trying to keep those fruits in the sun as best as we can, get those shoots growing upward. If it's a VSP, do the combing on the high cordon vines. All that work is constantly going on. You know it well if you have a vineyard, but a lot of your friends might not understand when they're wondering, like, why don't you come out with us on the weekends? I'm swimming through the vines today, so not in the lake, I guess. Here's that VitusGen project that I was mentioning or alluding to. It's helping to streamline our breeding by allowing us to map. This is in conjunction with Cornell researchers. They're mapping out these genes of an entire population of a cross. So meaning, like, there's a cross here, and all of these guys would be sisters to each other. By mapping those out, you can start to determine what genes are causing what. So if there's like a femality gene, for example, we can start to see where that is and figure that out, where that is on the chromosome. And then you have this ability to test. So when you make crosses in the future, you can take the leaf material at a very young age of the vine, rather than going through all the work of growing the vine, tending the vine, finally getting fruit, and finally then, you realize it's a female. It's like 3, 4, 5 years down the road. We could get it done in the first season within 1 year and make that determination like, okay, you're female, we don't need you, you're out at that stage. We could do this process with diseases as well, because there's disease-resistant genes, there's other things as far as color, you know, all these different things. So it's opening up a whole new, there's going to be a whole new trend in breeding in the future, of course, and you know, it's nothing to be scared about. I mean, it's not like genetic manipulation or anything like that. It's just, it's another tool to advance the process faster. We're doing a lot of training of the vines and installing new trellises, of course, at that time, irrigating. So that's what we're doing right now in July. In some of our vineyards, this is, Brad, you weren't here for this season. This was 2007. That beautiful vineyard VSP vinifera block, pretty much every post broke and went down with straight line winds in August. So it's a constant fixer-upper with these aging posts. They get to 25, 30 years at the most, they're breaking. So I'm pretty proactive now about checking all of my posts, actually breaking them beforehand and then fixing them. We're looking at a little bit more into like metal posts somewhat in some vineyards in Minnesota, but we don't know how well that's all going to work yet. The wood has been working well, but you know, I don't want to deal with this every couple of, you know, once a generation, I guess. Maybe my boy would like to someday, but I don't want to deal with that again. Here's that tour I talked about, September 6th. This is our open house, so we have a lot of grapes on plates, whatever is ready at that time of year. It's really cool to see some of these things that you'll never get to see anywhere else. You get to see some of the French hybrids that we're growing, you know, like Castel. Castel's got a beautiful flavor. You get to see some of our advanced selections. You get to see a lot of Elmer Swenson's varieties, all in one shot, one day, one plate, you know. So this year, it's 2014. It's going to be on the 6th. But it's always the Saturday after the Labor Day, every single year, which I know is a busy time for everybody. You guys are in the thick of harvest, but if you ever have a little breath, come on up and check it out. Then into September, October, we're doing the harvesting of all the promising varieties. You know, it's a fun time. Jenny's over here looking like, oh, you're taking another picture? Why don't you get to work once? I'm always taking the pictures for these things, and she's always doing all the work. And it's a good combination, though. It's great. Here's what the research winery does look like. This is Nick Smith right here. He's in charge of it. That was Brad Beam a lot of years ago now. But you know, we're just bringing in batches and making small batches here and there. We got small presses, small crusher D-stems. It's just a fun, busy little place to be in the fall. We're also doing some research on table grape evaluation, you know, looking for the hardy table grape. It's really hard to get the nice package of a beautiful look and seedlessness all in one shot. So, but we are working on that to an extent. And this is one of our last jobs of the season. Any vines that just haven't been performing for that year, they get oranged with an orange flag and rip them right out. So it's kind of fun. I like to see what those roots look like underneath. It gives you a good impression of how different vines are growing and why they're growing. You can sometimes start to see, now I understand why it was so bad, because the roots were full of phylloxera or something like that. And then, you know, it's just, the roots come in all shapes and sizes as well. These are really spaghetti-like and long. Sometimes you see more fibrous roots. You see everything in between. This is those vinifera again. If you're interested in growing something that's not quite hardy for your zone, you can do this method of pinning things down. There's some beautiful table grapes that we grow this way. It's totally worth it to get that higher market stuff, but it's a lot of work, definitely, and the timing has to be right. But you can see we're getting it down there. We're going to cover this with a big mound of straw. And that's what that would look like in the winter with the straw on it, and the rest of the vineyards are just left upright and allowed to do their thing. Like I said in the previous slide here, once you let the winter set in, I always feel like it's a nice time to start reading up on the next season and figuring things out. So what really helped me over the years, understanding the vines, was this Biology of the Grapevine, this Grapes book from these two guys out of New Zealand, the Grapevine from the Science to the Practice of Growing Vines, the Science of Grapevines, all these things, Sunlight into Wine. There's so many more books, but I got like a huge library that just, you know, I can't get enough of it, just can't read enough, because there's always new things to put into place. And, you know, not all of the things that are in these pertain to our particular region, but you can adapt. You can if you understand all the practices really well, you can start to use all these tools at different times and determine what's going to work well for you. Also, what we're doing is, so I'm in charge of the grape project. I'm the vineyard manager there, but we also have an orchard manager who deals with the apple trees, and that's a bigger project. Yeah, they have like 3,000 to 6,000 apple seedlings every single season, and they plant out rootstocks early in the spring, and then we T-bud onto those, and that's what that looks like. Each rootstock is going to get 2 buds in it from a specific genotype, and we do that. This year we're doing it like 6,000 times 2, which is 12,000 grafts. So it's going to be like a 2-week process. We're right in the middle of it. It's quite fun, but hopefully the next Honeycrisp or the next Sweet Tango is hiding within these little rubber bands right now. It's really fun to do that, and you can understand now how you can put multiple grafts, multiple apples on the same tree. That's a pretty cool process. We also do, my wife and I started this pumpkin thing out of nowhere a couple of years ago, and now we've grown up to 250 different varieties of pumpkin, squash, and gourd. And we've conquered like 5.5 acres of land this year. We broke the limit. Last year we were at 3 acres, and we thought that was enough. Like, oh, we're going to step it back. We stepped it forward. And I think next year we're going to relax. Next year. We always say next year, but we'll see what comes. It gets busy, but this is what that looks like in the fall, and it's really fun to see all that variety in one spot. 250 different types of squash and gourds, and the people love it. The people love it at the Arboretum. It gives a big fall color extension, to the leaves and whatnot. Even when the leaves fall, we get these beautiful pumpkins. So it's been going well, and we sell a lot of them on site too. We've really been making a name for this Australian butter. One of the best squash I've ever seen. It's just like creme brulee of the squash world. It's nice, smooth flesh, beautiful. That's my wife there, and then our helper Randy last year. She helped out quite a bit. So it's kind of a skeleton crew on all this stuff, but we get a lot of things done. And this is the team. This is the team for the vineyard. My wife, Peter Hempstead, the grape breeder and scientist. James Luby, he's professor and director of all of the fruit breeding that goes on, so strawberries, a little bit of cherries, what have you, all these small fruits. He's chair of all of that stuff. Katie Cook, our enologist and project leader, and Nick Smith, the winemaker and scientist. And then this season we have 2 helpers, Alana Robinson and Matt Erickson, who is part of make up our vineyard crew. So that's it. That's all of us. So with that, I thank you for listening, and we can maybe handle a few questions yet if we have some time, but I appreciate it.